So this is an interesting thought experiment, but we need to frame it in a way that is more realistic to the current situation in Gaza, because what is not realistic is we just take a Hamas commander and plop him in Manhattan, and then we bomb Manhattan, killing hundreds of Americans, but we got that terrorist leader. No, what you're actually asking me is, would we strike New York and therefore kill civilians if there was a large terrorist network operating a massive tunnel system that shuttled weapons and equipment and military personnel between various boroughs of New York City, and that the people of New York either would not or could not stand up against these terrorist cells? Because in reality, I guarantee New Yorkers aren't going to allow Hamas to set up a foothold in their city. But for argument's sake, let's say there are equal parts of New York's population that are aiding Hamas, as well as the other side just being afraid to do anything with regard to ejecting Hamas from their city. And side note, it's worth noting that in 2006, Hamas won a majority of the elected seats in the Palestinian Legislative Council. So the Palestinian people voted them in, and they've held that power since then. So therefore, in this scenario, we would have to assume that New York City would have voted Hamas in this situation if it were to be similar to Gaza. So given all of that, in this case, the answer is yes. It is an unfortunate but acceptable collateral damage to stop Hamas attacks on its American neighbors, whether it's New Jersey or Pennsylvania or even Canada for that matter. But we need to also look historically here, because as I said in my previous videos, the vast majority of the larger generations that are up and coming, the young people, have never experienced this type of warfare personally. What they've seen is what's happening in Ukraine. What they may have seen, if they're a little older, is what took place in Iraq. But for all intents and purposes, the Iraq War, when they finally came online with understanding of what was going on, we were past the initial stages of the invasion. To see what is needing to take place in Israel is we have to go back to World War II, unfortunately. When Germany was operating or occupying France, just like Hamas is essentially occupying Palestine, and there are plenty of videos of Palestinians that don't like Hamas, but Hamas is occupying Gaza City, just like Germany was occupying France. France obviously was an ally to the United States, the United Kingdom, etc. In order to get the Germans out of France, the Allied powers executed a massive bombing campaign against German targets. Now, obviously everyone's like, well, that was like 70-ish years ago. Why can't we just use technology? Well, as you see in Russia and Ukraine, sometimes technology just isn't what wins the day. We still use old artillery like we did back in the day, and we still use airstrikes. But inevitably, French civilians were killed during this bombing campaign. They were killed by American and British bombs, unfortunately. And they were killed because the Allied powers were trying to eject the Germans. But no one blamed the Allied powers for the deaths of the French civilians. Much like the broader goal of Israel is to eject Hamas from Palestine, the broader goal of the Allied powers was to eject Germany from France. That campaign continued into Germany, where I'm sure plenty of German civilians that disagreed with the Nazi Party were probably killed. But the Allied bombing was necessary because you have to destroy the enemy where they are. And if they use civilians, unfortunately, and civilian infrastructure to defend their assets, then by the rules of war that I legitimately quoted, a direct quote in my last video, the laws of armed conflict, as outlined by the United Nations, those that are using civilians are the war criminals. Those that are killing the civilians while not trying to, because they're just there, and at this point, because Hamas puts them there, they are not the war criminals. Again, if civilians were considered to be legitimate defenses for military equipment, meaning if we placed civilians in just military bases everywhere and said, you can't hit our bases, you can't hit our equipment, it would set a very dangerous precedence that militaries would just start keeping civilians on the battlefield in order to protect their military assets. As gross as it is that civilians die on the battlefield, that children die on the battlefield, that is the world we live in. And we have to operate and plan in the real world, not a utopian world where no civilians die and no children get hurt. The difference is, in this case, only one side is actually targeting civilians with a complete disregard of where their rockets go, and that is Hamas. Well, Hamas and Russia, when you count Ukraine. Israel, they're shooting at military targets that Hamas has civilians around. Ukraine, they're shooting at military targets. And if there's Russian civilians in the area, that is unfortunate collateral damage. And that's just the realities of the world we live in today.